train station, we have to talk about the Reading station in
Oh,
Philadelphia.
Reading Terminal? Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
What's
Fantastic
its story?
station. Very interesting story there because the Reading had a very wild ride in terms of its financial health. It was either up or it was down. I mean, it didn't seem to have any even keel at all. The Reading Railroad got its start basically hauling coal, and particularly anthracite. The interesting story with the anthracite business, which basically built the Reading Railroad, was that when going back even to George Washington's time, Philadelphia was growing very rapidly, and the problems that they were running into were that they were running out of fuel for cooking and heating, and Philadelphia was becoming denuded of its trees. They're all being chopped down and burned. And another problem Philadelphia was having was the yellow fever epidemics, which people erroneously attributed to bad drinking water. Okay, that was not the reason. And so people were just starting to experiment with coal, but they were using Virginia coal, and Virginia coal was bituminous or soft coal. And it was very expensive to bring up to Philadelphia because in those days there were no railroads. So a Philadelphian named Josiah White, one of the great Philadelphians as far as I'm concerned, came up. Well, he'd heard that there was anthracite coal up along the Lehigh River, and nobody could figure out how to ignite it. That was the problem. He went up there and he bought several wagon loads of this anthracite and brought it down. He had a nail factory in Fairmount, so he has this hard coal there, and his guys are trying to light it up, and it won't light, it won't light, it won't light. And so finally it's a Friday afternoon, and it's time to go home. And so the workers were really disgusted. They took all their remaining anthracite and threw it in the furnace, locked the door, and left. Okay. Well, one of the workers remembered that he'd left his coat in the mill. So an hour later, he goes back to get his coat, and when he opens the door, vroom, there is this enormous fire going. So he notifies Josiah White, who not wanting to waste any resources. He calls all of his workers back, and they did 3 heats of iron from just this one fire. So he knew he was onto something. Time was of the essence. You had to pay attention to time when you're lighting anthracite. And because he was in the metal business, he now began experimenting with different shapes of grates and sizes of grates. Because anthracite, quite frankly, is a very good fuel compared to other types of coal. It burns hotter. It's 16,000 BTUs per pound of anthracite, 12,000 BTUs per pound of bituminous. And you get some crappy coals out there, like brown coal. I mean, they get like 4,000 BTUs. So, I mean, this was a really good coal. It didn't do much in the way of sparks, and it had very little ash, relatively speaking. So it was good fuel. So he goes up to where he's been buying his cartloads of coal, a little town called March Chunk. And March Chunk, he buys up mineral rights to 20,000 acres. So now he's bringing in, he's now mining this coal, and he wants to bring it down to the Lehigh River because if he builds a canal along the Lehigh, he can float the coal down to the Delaware and then go down the state canal along the Delaware River to Philadelphia. That's his plan. But the problem he runs into is his mine is like up on a hill, Summit Mountain, okay? And so how's he going to get the coal down from Summit Mountain to the river? Well, he's going to have wagons come down, and by gravity, he used for the very first time in the United States, he used a surveyor's transit to shoot the line and grade of a path running down the hill that would be all sloped down in the direction of the heavy traffic. So, I mean, now that's a very common thing on railroads, but he was the first one to do it. And then he took wooden planks and put wooden planks down on this path, and so he created a railed road. Another first time experience. This is like right after the War of 1812. So now he's got the coal coming down the hill, but how do you get the empty wagons back up the hill? Well, his solution is he's going to bring mules. He's going to put mules in these cars, and they're going to roll down, and then they're going to get off at the bottom of the hill, and then the mules are going to pull the empties back up the hill.
Fun ride for the mule.
Yeah, well, the mules had motion sickness. This was not good. So he would put a boy in each car, and the boy would be feeding the mules hay to take care of their motion sickness. And so Josiah White loves to say this. He invented the first railroad dining car. So I tell you, I know we're talking about Philadelphia railroads, but Mott's Chunk, which is now called Jim Thorpe, is a really good place to visit. I mean, that is a very interesting town. They've done a wonderful job of maintaining the historic nature of so many different things that were associated with the coal industry. So
What do you see if you go there? So what do you see? What do you see if you go there?
Well, I happen to enjoy cycling, and so there are numerous paths up through there to cycle. They have created a model gravity railroad that I described. There's whitewater rafting on the Lehigh River. The town itself, they have the coal barons, mansions up on the hill there. They have a tourist railroad that takes you around, and then the Molly Maguires, who were the Irish miners in that area, and who were constantly quarreling with their English and Welsh bosses. And so a lot of them ended up in jailed there and then executed there. And so you can go there and visit the jail where the Molly Maguires were.
Well, part of your book talks about some of the titans of industry, like you mentioned J. Edgar Thompson, and J.P. Morgan is in your book.
Oh, yeah.
And talking about Franklin Gowen.
Oh, yes, yes. Franklin Gowen ties in nicely with Jim Thorpe or Mott's Chunk. He was trained as an attorney, and he was actually the district attorney for Carbon County at one point. But then he applied for a job at the Reading Railroad, or in those days called the Philadelphia Reading Railroad in Philadelphia, where their offices were. And he became their chief counsel. And within about 6 years, he became president of that railroad. And he very much enjoyed being a prosecutor. And even though he was no longer in that business in Carbon County, he volunteered to come up and be special prosecutor. So he was very much involved in getting convictions of something like 26 Molly Maguires. And those convictions were reversed by Governor Milton Shapp. He said miscarriage of justice. And so all those convictions were overturned after these men had been
too late.
hung, something like 100 years earlier. But Gowen really attempted to take over as much of the railroad business as he possibly could. The charter of the Reading Railroad forbids the railroad from getting into the coal mining business. He ignored that prescription, and instead he created the Reading Coal and Iron Company. And so the Reading Railroad is now mining coal, and when a mining company other than his own would call up and say, I need a couple cars to take coal out of my mine. Well, I'm sorry, all of our cars are accounted for. So I mean, he was a real slick guy, and he attempted to take on the competition, which in his case was the Pennsylvania Railroad, by forming alliances with other railroads like the New York Central and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And he actually was able to put together a route which ran from Philadelphia on up to Raritan Bay, Jersey City. And so that was successful. However, as he got more and more into coal mining, the price of coal dropped. There was an oversupply of coal. He did everything he could to find new markets for anthracite. He went as far as to sell anthracite in England. Britain is basically a lump of coal with some dirt on top. I mean, it is a coal mine.
Carrying coals to Newcastle.
There you are. There you are. That's exactly what he tried to do. But eventually, things got to be so bad, and J.P. Morgan became an investor in some of his activities, and it occurred to Morgan that he had to get rid of this man. He just couldn't keep him around, and so that's what happened. He was run out of the business, and he committed suicide. So.
Well, you also talked about in your book about the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Reading Railroad owning steamships.
Oh yeah, yeah. The Pennsylvania Railroad was a truly intermodal company handling customers' logistics, and the problem in Philadelphia was that there were a series of islands in the Delaware River off Walnut Street, Chestnut Street, and these islands were so close to the piers that ships were limited in terms of their length, in terms of ability to use these piers. And this became a problem for the Pennsylvania Railroad because they were having more and more business and they wanted to have bigger and bigger ships. So the Pennsylvania Railroad then began developing railroad lines in South Philadelphia along South Delaware Avenue, or what is now called Christopher Columbus Boulevard. And it looked as though the Center City port was going to die on the vine because it was just too small. There was a Philadelphia, everyone should know this firm, Cramp Shipyard. Cramp Shipyard was the great builder of ships in Philadelphia for many, many years, a century probably. And Cramp received a commission from the Pennsylvania Railroad to build 4 iron ships, steam-powered ships that were 350 feet long. Now that's not a big ship today, but in 1870 that was a big deal. So the Philadelphians now realized that they were going to have to get rid of these islands. And so they put together a plan for this. They brought in the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad to assist them with this. And so they eventually were able to dig up these islands and dump the materials in South Philadelphia down around the Philadelphia Navy base. If you go down to the Philadelphia Navy base, you'll see that they're like big railroad yards just to the north to I-95. I-95 cuts through there as sort of a northern boundary. And then there's these long, wide railroad yards. That's all fill land from where these islands were dug up. So that was an important improvement for Philadelphia. And then the Reading Railroad also got into, as Franklin Gowen was attempting to export coal, he was also attempting to build his own ships, but that didn't work out. That was, that was not his expertise. So he also went to Cramp Shipyard, and Cramp built him ships.
You mentioned earlier on in this discussion about the Baldwin Company. Can you talk about the Baldwin Company and how important they were in Philly?
Now, Baldwin, Matthias Baldwin, a very interesting fellow, started out as a jeweler. He went through an apprenticeship as a jeweler. And after several years of that, he got into the manufacture of implements for manufacturing other things. And so the steam engine, which had come into existence around 1700 in Britain, various improvements were made on the steam engine. He took an interest in this technology, and he created his own steam engine. But this was not the kind you would put on a train or a ship. It was a stationary engine. But it was a power source. Philadelphia had a very long history of manufacturing activity before Baldwin, because Philadelphia is located where the Piedmont meets the Tidewater. And so you have hills coming out, like along the Wissahickon Creek is a beautiful example of this. Hills coming out of the Piedmont flowing into the Tidewater, the Schuylkill River. And this fast-running water allows for the creation of water mills. And so here in Philadelphia, we have historic Rittenhouse Town. That was a paper mill from 1690, making use of one of the tributaries of the Wissahickon Creek. There's a really nice mill to visit in New Jersey, Clinton, New Jersey, called the Red Mill. I mean, that's an actual working mill, water mill. So a very interesting thing to say. So Baldwin now, with his stationary engine, no longer had to be along a creek. I mean, he now had his own power source. All he had to do was hook up belts to the steam engine, and he could run power up to the higher floors of the building, and he essentially created a factory. And he was doing this down at the corner of around 3rd and Walnut Streets. And the interesting thing about that particular area of the city is it was the location of the American Philosophical Society, which in those days was the United States Patent Office.
Kind of near Independence Hall.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, in fact, it's the only non-federal-owned building in that complex there. They continue. The American Philosophical Society continues to do what it does right here in Philadelphia, although it is no longer, obviously, the U.S. Patent Office. But the really nice thing about this, and this portends for the state of Pennsylvania's own industrial development, was that it provided a clearinghouse where people who were interested in what was being made, what was going on, could come and listen to presentations. And then they could come up afterwards and have a question and answer session with the presenter. And then they could all get together for lunch and talk about what everyone else was doing. And so the American Philosophical Society became the incubator for Philadelphia's Industrial Revolution. And I would say for the United States' own Industrial Revolution. Baldwin quickly outgrew his machine shop at 3rd and Walnut. And now he's looking for a bigger place to spread out. And fortunately, in those days, there was a large tract of undeveloped land in Philly up around Broad Street and Spring Garden Street. It was an estate that had belonged first to the William Penn family, and later it became known as Bush Hill. So there was a lot of vacant land up there, and he went up and he purchased 17 acres of land. A number of his associates who had attended these American Philosophical Society meetings, they also moved up in there. And that whole area, one of my slides shows that, it was really a powerhouse industrial area and lasted right up until World War I. The Baldwin first manufactured what for all intents and purposes would be a toy train. He received an offer from a man named Franklin Peel, who had the Philadelphia Museum up around Broad and Cow Hill. And he said, "Can you make a little train that goes around my shop?" And he said, "Sure, I can do that." And can it carry like 2 passengers? "Oh yeah, I can make it for 2 passengers." So Philadelphians loved it. They had never seen a locomotive before. This was the first locomotive in Philadelphia. So then another railroad called the Philadelphia, Germantown, and Norristown went to him and said, "Could you build a locomotive for us to pull passengers and freight?"
A real one.
A real one, yeah, industrial strength. So he built one for them, but they got into a dispute over payment, and Baldwin said, "I'm never going to build another locomotive." But wrong, because now the Pennsylvania Main Line of Public Works came to him and said, "Well, we're building this line from Philadelphia to Columbia, Pennsylvania. Would you build us 7 locomotives?" So Baldwin said, "Oh yes, I'll do that, sure." So next thing you know, his business just really took off, and he was the powerhouse locomotive builder in the United States, and about 40% of his output was exported. He was a big hitter, and he really hit his peak in the first decade of the 20th century. That was a period in which American and other, but particularly American railroads were buying not only more and more locomotives, they were buying bigger and bigger and bigger locomotives. And he had this multi-story factory at Broad and Spring Garden. He had 17 acres of ground on which he had built 64 acres of floor space. I mean, it was a big, tall building. And with all these new orders just pouring in, he couldn't continue doing this. So around 1907, he made the decision to move to the suburbs. One of the first of many. And so he went to Delaware County, and he bought 600 acres of land along the Delaware River down near Eddystone. And he began building this one-story factory. That factory took a long time to construct. I mean, you can imagine anything that big. And so he finally was able to move all of his Philadelphia operations to Delaware County.
So that was instead of Philadelphia, not in
Right,
addition to
instead, yes. He abandoned Philadelphia in 1928. Now, getting to the J.P. Morgan story on this, J.P. Morgan had assisted the Baldwin Locomotive Company switch from having a partnership form of ownership to a corporate form of ownership. And he had done this around 1909. And so he was then personally familiar with what Baldwin's capabilities and plans were. So when he sees Baldwin building this enormous plant out there in Delaware County, he said, and World War I had started, and J.P. Morgan was appointed His Majesty's purchasing agent for the British Crown. So he comes to Baldwin and says, "We want you to manufacture cannons and ammunition and rifles for the British Army. Can you do that for us?" And he said, "Sure, I'll let you have my new factory." So as what was completed out there in Delaware County now became the arms plant for the British government. And over the course of World War I, Baldwin sold the British $250 million worth of weaponry. So that was quite good. But then, as I was saying, in 1928, Baldwin completed his move out of the city. The Reading Railroad had lost a customer up there at Bush Hill, so they then cut a deal with the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the Philadelphia Inquirer occupied a portion of what had been the Baldwin footprint. And if you go up there today, I mean, the beautiful Elverson building, which the Inquirer no longer occupies, they're now back to their original location on Market Street.
Another manufacturer that you mentioned in your book is the Budd Company.
Yeah.
What kind of trains did they make, and who was behind that?
Yeah, Edward G. Budd was a very interesting fellow. Grew up on a farm in Delaware, and right not far from where he grew up, two Frenchmen had come over, like in the 1870s, and they had smuggled out of France with them the plans for how to stamp out metal products. This was a new technology, metal stamping, and it was, the French thought they had a monopoly on it, but these two workers had smuggled out plans. So they created a factory inside of a barn, and inside this barn there was one room with a guard at the door, and nobody could go in and out except if you were permitted to by these two Frenchmen. Well, one of the people who got a chance to look at this was Edward G. Budd, and he was like 16 years old at the time. And he said, this is it. I think I know what I'm going to do. And he immediately took off for Philadelphia and began working in the metals industry. A man named William Sellers. Sellers had machine shops all around Bush Hill. And he got a job there, first working as a draftsman. And then at night, when he wasn't working, he would go to the Franklin Institute, which was on 7th Street at the time, and he would learn metallurgy and welding. So by 1912, he was so well advanced in his knowledge that he left his employer at the time, started his own business, and he began creating, by metal stamping and welding, automobiles. Philadelphia had quite a role in the automobile industry. Quite a few different automobiles, alphabetically from Buick on up to Willis, were being, their bodies now were being stamped out and welded here in Philadelphia by Budd Company.
What kind of railroad cars did they make?
Railroad, yeah, he manufactured passenger cars. He manufactured passenger cars for the Reading Railroad, the Crusader, the trains for the Canadian National and the Canadian Pacific, their passenger lines to Banff and Lake Louise. They were all Budd Company cars. And in more modern times, Budd Company manufactured passenger cars for Amtrak and SEPTA. But, you know, that, once again, it's something that's no longer around Philadelphia anymore.
Can you talk about the political clout that the Pennsylvania Railroad had at its peak?
Oh, yeah. The gentleman whose responsibility it became to build 30th Street Station was the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, William Atterby. Okay. He was also the head of the Republican Party in Pennsylvania. So, I mean, he was a powerful hitter. And pretty much the Pennsylvania Railroad could dictate what they wanted in Harrisburg. They had that capability. And in Philadelphia, they had a lot of clout as well. That's why it became kind of difficult for the city to pursue its interests in the Ben Franklin Parkway, when, in fact, the Pennsylvania Railroad said, no, we would rather not do that. But then they were able to work things out, where the city basically said, we'll pay for various improvements for 30th Street.
You say in your book, you mentioned already a couple of them, but you have a lot of different railroads that were running at the time. The Philadelphia and Columbia, the Philadelphia, Germantown, and Norristown that you mentioned, the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore, the Philadelphia and Reading, and the South Penn Railroad. When did they all start? Did they start consolidating at some point?
Oh, absolutely, yes. For example, early on, there were mergers that were end-to-end mergers. I mentioned the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad. Within the period of time that it took to build these railroads, the people involved realized that it made more sense to unite than to compete. And in New Jersey, for example, every time a railroad came along, the people who were already running railroads said, why don't you join us? So then you had something called the United Railroads of New Jersey. And the Pennsylvania Railroad was in an acquisition mode, particularly under J. Thompson. And they acquired the United Railroads of New Jersey. They acquired the Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, and Chicago Railroad, which was huge. That was like a 425-mile long railroad. And that took them from Pittsburgh to Chicago, so that by Thompson's death, the Pennsylvania Railroad had taken on the parameters, if you will, of what the Pennsylvania Railroad looked like in 1968 when it went through this disastrous merger with the New York Central. And then the Reading, we talk about the Reading having acquired numerous other lines.
If you were a manufacturer or a business and you wanted to ship something, could you generally choose which railroad you wanted to ship on, or were you usually in a place where you had one choice?
The industries loved to find locations that were served by more than one railroad. And that way they could beat each other up. Oh, you want to charge me $500 to send it to Philadelphia? Well, over here, he's going to charge me $400. And another favorite trick was the manufacturer would own its own railroad. And so its own railroad would go from its factory to a connection with, call it the Pennsylvania Railroad. And so the little railroad would say to the Pennsylvania Railroad, I got this order here, and I'd like to ship it on your railroad. And the Pennsylvania Railroad said, well, that's $500. Oh, no. The shipper will only let me have $200. So this kind of competition and chicanery, if you will, got to a point where the Interstate Commerce Commission, which all railroaders will tell you was the worst thing that ever happened, the railroads asked for it. They wanted to have the Interstate Commerce Commission. And basically it was a way to prevent these kinds of manipulations. Things really went to hell in 1906 with the Hepburn Act. The Hepburn Act gave the Interstate Commerce Commission authority over railroad rate making, which meant that railroads could no longer charge whatever it is they felt like charging. And so now the shippers love this because they formed their own association. It was called the NIT League, National Industrial Transportation League. And they would, every time the railroads would come into the ICC with a request for a rate increase, the NIT League would come in and say, oh, no, they shouldn't get an increase. They should be cutting their rates. So, I mean, this went back and forth until finally in 1976, everyone realized that deregulation had to happen. And so President Carter, believe it or not, was the start of this deregulation of the airline industry, trucking industry, railroads, and finally the port, the ocean shipping business. 1984.
We only have about a minute or so left. And before we started talking about this, you mentioned another book you're working on having to do with the centennial and the sesquicentennial.
Yes.
Tell us something about the sesquicentennial.
Okay, the sesquicentennial of 1926 was held in Philadelphia, and it was held in South Philadelphia. And it caused a lot of controversy because many people did not want it to occur the way it turned out. They did not want an international exposition. They wanted to have an old home week around Independence Hall. And the mayor at the time, Freeland Kendrick, was beholden to contractors for contributions. And they said, you have to build an international exposition, and you have to build it in South Philadelphia because that's where we are. So the Vare family, Pennsylvania, there was a Pennsylvania Senator Vare, there was a Congressman Vare. These were all brothers, you know. And so the Vare said, you got to build it in South Philadelphia. Well, the Philadelphians hated that, and I get into quite a bit of that in the book about the tussle between those who wanted to do things in Independence Hall.
And when do you think the book will be coming out?
I would hope it will be out by the spring of next year.
Okay. Well, we are out of time, unfortunately. I think we could go on and on. But if you want to know more of the story, you'll have to read the book. It is called Philadelphia, A Railroad History, and its author is Edward W. Duffy. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I very much enjoyed being here today.